And we can take you now to the US, where the Justice Department is announcing the criminal charges against China's Huawei. Let's take a look.
First, I am announcing that a grand jury in Seattle has returned an indictment that alleges 10 federal crimes by 2 affiliates of telecommunications corporation Huawei Technologies. According to the indictment, in 2012, Huawei began a concerted effort to steal information about a robot that T-Mobile used to test mobile phones. In an effort to build their own robot, Huawei's engineers allegedly violated confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements with T-Mobile by secretly taking photos of the robot, measuring it, and even stealing a piece of it. I'm also announcing today a grand jury in New York has returned an indictment alleging 13 additional crimes committed by Huawei, its CFO, its affiliate in Iran, and one of its subsidiaries here in the United States. The criminal activity alleged in this indictment goes back at least 10 years and goes all the way to the top of the company. As early as 2007, Huawei employees allegedly began to misrepresent the company's relationship with its Iranian affiliate, which is called Skycom. Huawei employees allegedly told banking partners that Huawei had sold its ownership interest in Skycom, but these claims were false. In reality, Huawei had sold Skycom to itself. By claiming that Skycom was a separate company and not an affiliate of Huawei, which it actually controlled, Huawei allegedly asserted that all of its Iranian business was in compliance with the American sanctions. These alleged false claims led banks to do business with the company and therefore to unknowingly violate our laws. One bank facilitated more than $100 million worth of Skycom transactions through the United States in just 4 years. Huawei allegedly lied about other relationships as well. In 2017, when one bank decided to terminate its global banking relationship with Huawei over a concern about risk, the company allegedly told other banks that Huawei was distancing itself from the bank, not the other way around.
An explosive media conference happening at the Justice Department just moments ago. Yes, Huawei very much in the dock, facing numerous charges, including bank and wire fraud and obstructing justice. Serious stuff indeed.
The firm's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, is currently in custody in Canada at the request of the United States. And of course, there's been great diplomatic back and forth over Huawei between Canada and the US and China. And so now this is a very significant movement that we're seeing coming out of the Department of Justice in the US.
Interesting to see what the Australian government says in response to that this morning as well. Now, thousands of Queenslanders will have restricted access.
So we've got this breaking news that's just come through in the last half hour or so, a significant story in terms of international relations. The US government has announced multiple criminal charges against the Chinese tech giant Huawei. Huawei is accused of numerous offences, including conspiring to steal trade secrets. The company is accused of taking photos, measurements and stealing a part of a robot designed by a US telecommunications giant T-Mobile. Other charges ranged from bank and wire fraud to obstructing justice and violating international sanctions. Let's take a listen to the start of this media conference that started about half an hour ago.
Huawei allegedly did this in an attempt to, among other things, manipulate those other banks into expanding and maintaining their banking relationships with Huawei.
And so I might just go now to what a couple of other people have said during that media conference. There were multiple department secretaries who've spoken there. The FBI boss said that Huawei repeatedly refused to accept US law, sought to steal valuable intellectual property from a US company, relied on dishonest business practices, and concluded saying, "We should all be concerned about any company beholden to a foreign government that tries to burrow into our telecommunications network." And just from the one of the Trump officials was saying at that media conference that this demonstrates that the Trump administration is tougher on those who violate sanctions than any other administration in US history. And for Chinese, he was saying for years, Chinese firms have broken our laws and undermined undermined our sanctions, and this will end. And just to give you an idea of how deeply concerned the Chinese are about this situation, the Huawei CFO was detained in Canada a couple of months back now, and at that point, she had been detained pending the outcome of this investigation into the US. And so we've had this development this morning with the US declaring that it will pursue these charges, and so presumably that extradition proceeding is going to take place in Canada shortly to try and get Meng Wanzhou over the border into the US. But yeah, just to give you an idea about how fiercely the Chinese think about her detention, China has previously demanded that Canada release Meng Wanzhou. The Vice Foreign Minister at the time summoned both the US and Canadian ambassadors and lodged a strong protest urging her release. The ministry described Ms Meng's arrest as extremely nasty and insisted that she had not violated any laws. And it had issued a warning to the US at the time saying China will respond further depending on any US actions. We haven't heard yet what the Chinese response to this is, but that news conference is actually still proceeding now. Let's take a listen in. They've actually gone on to the Mueller investigation at the moment, but we might take a bit of a listen into that, and then hopefully we'll be able to have a chat to our US correspondent James Glenday, and we'll be pursuing comment from other people through the day on this story.
As soon as possible.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay, so that media conference has only just wrapped up there in the US. But yeah, we'll be following that story closely through the day. So just going through those charges, I think there's only one charge in relation to a robot. The Huawei and its executives were trying to get information on this robot, and photos were taken. And so there's a suggestion there that somehow that Huawei and its executives were part of an effort to undermine the telecommunications network in the US. And then a number of other charges go to trading with companies in Iran in particular. There was earlier suggestion that there was also trade. Huawei was trying to pursue trade with Syria and Sudan as well. Not sure if that's part of these charges, but definitely Iran. Multiple charges about violating sanctions against trade with Iran. So yeah, this is a bombshell in US-China relations, considering what's been said on this before, and we'll be getting comment on this story throughout the day. Now, the US Justice Department has filed charges against Chinese tech firm Huawei. North America correspondent James Glenday joins us now from Washington. James, just first of all, before we get into the detail of this, tell us about the significance of this in terms of US-China relations.
Well, we don't really know exactly what it's going to mean in the long run for US-China relations, Joe, but you'd have to think it's going to be pretty significant. This was a pretty big press conference. We knew it was coming. We knew that the United States was going to press ahead with the extradition of Huawei's CFO, Meng Wanzhou, but we didn't know what the charges would be. And there wasn't just one indictment that was partially unsealed, which revealed the charges in New York, which relates to Ms. Meng, but there was also another one in Seattle, which made a series of other accusations, or makes a series of other accusations against the Chinese technology giant as well. So it is certainly very significant that these charges are being pushed ahead with at a time when, of course, the United States and China's relationship is at a pretty much, not an all-time low, but it's certainly not in a good place. And we're in the midst of a truce in a fairly substantial trade war.
Okay, so let's go to the charges now. Does it appear that there are two sets of charges? One in relation to the taking photos of some kind of robot with suggestions that Huawei may have been trying to eventually burrow into the US telecommunications network somehow, and a separate set related to an effort to skirt sanctions against Iran?
So, yes, that's correct. Two different lots of sanctions. That second one you refer to is the one from New York, and that relates to Ms. Meng and the effort to skirt sanctions with Iran. They date back quite some time, more than 10 years. It essentially accuses Huawei and some of its subsidiaries of bank and wire fraud and then obstructing justice as well. And we're going to hear more about those charges next month when that extradition takes place of Ms. Meng, or certainly the hearing to begin the extradition process takes place in Vancouver on February the 6th. The other lot of charges which you mentioned relate to the Chinese telecommunication giant allegedly taking photos of a robot that was used to test phones by company T-Mobile, and then even an allegation that parts of that robotic tester product were also stolen as well. So certainly quite significant allegations, and it was quite the press conference. I know some of it's already been played, but some very, very high-level figures in the US government making this announcement and making a real show of making the announcement as well.
Yeah, and the FBI rep made mention of foreign governments trying to burrow into telecommunications networks of the US. Is it clear that there are specific allegations in relation to that claim?
I think it's going to be really interesting to see how these cases play out, because for a long time the US government has made the case to its allies that Huawei shouldn't be used. It's tried to discourage US companies from using Huawei technology, and it's actively campaigned for foreign allies to not use, in particular, Huawei's 5G network, also other types of technology, but particularly 5G. And we've seen Australia, New Zealand, other nations as well come out and say that they're not going to allow Huawei to bid for that. There's certainly a debate taking place at the moment in Canada over whether Huawei should be allowed to bid for the technology as well. So that's the backdrop to this, and now we have some more specific allegations about exactly what may or may not be able to be done through this technology. The long allegation has been, and Huawei denies this, is that the infrastructure that Huawei is putting in place could be used as a conduit for either spying or indeed sabotage some point down the line, because of the fairly blurred lines in China between the Chinese Communist Party and, of course, private or so-called private companies.
And so the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou was detained in Canada over the border last month pending an extradition hearing. What has been the strength of China's argument against that detention up until now?
Well, it's made a series of arguments saying that she should be released, she shouldn't have been detained at all. It's saying that this is effectively political hostage-taking by the United States or Canada on behalf of the United States because of that ongoing trade war. And the timing of her arrest did coincide with that meeting in Argentina between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, where they agreed to this temporary truce in discussions, or truce where they were going to work it out for 90 days about how to deal with the growing number of tariffs on either side. But I think what is probably perhaps even more significant is the way in which China seems to have responded to that. And we've seen two Canadians detained in China. We've also seen a Canadian who was appealing a sentence of 15 years have his sentence for drug trafficking elevated to the death penalty. And in perhaps a separate case, we've also seen an Australian citizen detained there as well. And in Canada, this has been front page news virtually every single day. And it's even led to the resignation of the country's ambassador in China, who made some comments saying that he thought that Meng Wanzhou had a pretty good case when it came to fighting extradition to the United States. And as I mentioned, we expect that formal court proceeding and for that all to begin on February the 6th, though extradition is going to be a longer process.
And James, it was interesting during that media conference hearing one of those spokesmen saying that this issue is wholly separate from the trade negotiations with China. But yeah, there's obviously some pretty fierce emotion when it comes to this particular case.
Yeah, and I think from the Justice Department's point of view, this is absolutely separate. They've been looking at this for a very, very long time. They've been looking at enforcing sanctions on a vast array of companies, but for some time it's been reported that Huawei was a company of particular interest because of the way it used a subsidiary, which it effectively is accused of selling to itself, to evade sanctions on Iran. But you've also got to keep in mind what President Donald Trump has said about this case. He said that, I'll do whatever I can or whatever I need to in this case to make sure that it's in America's best interests, which seemed to be a pretty strong suggestion that maybe, she could, that Meng Wanzhou, who is of course, that Meng Wanzhou, who is of course very senior in the company, the daughter of the company's founder, could be used as some sort of perhaps pawn in this broader trade negotiation. So I think you've got to keep that in mind in this whole process as well. But it is absolutely going to be fascinating to see how these cases pan out, particularly because really for the first time you would assume we're going to, if these cases go to trial in the United States, we're going to see the American government effectively lay out why they believe Huawei is such a threat, in a courtroom that is, to Western security.
Yeah. Okay, James Glenday reporting there from Washington.